Sometimes the person trying hardest to destroy your confidence is desperately trying to protect something inside themselves. And here is the part they do not want you to understand. The cruelty may have less to do with your weakness than with what your presence awakens inside them. You saw something, you felt something, you stopped playing along, and suddenly the person who seemed so powerful began working desperately to convince you that you were the problem. But what if their need to hurt you is not proof that you are insignificant? What if it is a reaction to something they cannot comfortably face within themselves? Stay with me, because once you understand that, their behavior begins to look very different. Have you ever noticed that the moment you stopped explaining yourself, stopped chasing, or stopped trying to prove your love, the relationship became more hostile? That is important. Because when a person has become accustomed to regulating their emotional world through another person's attention, reassurance, submission, or admiration, your withdrawal can create an uncomfortable confrontation with themselves, and this is where we need to be careful. When someone repeatedly hurts another person, it can be tempting to assume that the behavior comes from strength, confidence, or complete lack of feeling. But sometimes the opposite is closer to the truth. Beneath controlling, cruel, or humiliating behavior, there may be unresolved emotional pain that the person does not know how to recognize or process. This does not excuse the harm they cause, and it does not mean every harmful person is secretly wounded in the same way. It simply helps us understand one possible emotional mechanism behind the behavior. A person carrying deep shame may experience ordinary situations as threats to their sense of worth. Criticism, rejection, disagreement, or even another person's independence can awaken painful feelings of inadequacy. Instead of being able to sit with those feelings and say, "I feel insecure," they may unconsciously defend themselves by attacking someone else. The other person becomes the place where uncomfortable emotions are discharged. This can create a confusing dynamic. You may notice that the more secure you become, the more intensely they criticize you. Your boundary may be interpreted as disrespect. Your success may be treated as arrogance. Your silence may be described as cruelty. Your refusal to argue may provoke even more arguments. What appears irrational from the outside can sometimes make emotional sense when viewed as a defensive reaction to threatened self-worth. The important distinction is that understanding the wound does not require you to tolerate the behavior. Compassion should never become permission for mistreatment. You can recognize that someone may be struggling internally while still protecting yourself from their actions. You also do not need to become responsible for healing what they refuse to confront. Their shame belongs to them. Their insecurity belongs to them. Their emotional history belongs to them. You can respond with clarity, establish boundaries, and step away when necessary without accepting the belief that their pain gives them the right to make you suffer. When you stop interpreting their cruelty as proof of your inadequacy, you begin separating their emotional struggle from your identity. And that separation can become the beginning of genuine freedom. When you begin setting boundaries with someone who is accustomed to having access to your emotions, attention, time, or decisions, something important can happen. The boundary does not simply change your behavior. It can reveal how dependent the relationship was on your willingness to accommodate the other person. As long as you kept explaining, forgiving, chasing, and adjusting yourself, the unhealthy dynamic could remain hidden beneath the appearance of connection. But once you say no, refuse disrespect, or stop participating in endless conflict, the underlying pattern becomes much easier to see. A person who needs control may experience your boundary as a personal attack rather than as a normal expression of your needs. You might say, "I cannot continue this conversation while you insult me." And instead of reflecting on the insult, they may accuse you of being cold or uncaring. You may decide not to answer provocative messages, and suddenly your silence becomes the supposed problem. You may make an independent decision, and they may describe it as betrayal. This reaction can leave you questioning yourself. You may think, "Am I being selfish? Am I being too harsh? Should I explain myself again?" But a healthy boundary does not require another person's approval. Its purpose is not to control them. Its purpose is to define what you will and will not participate in. This is why boundaries can expose what someone has been trying to hide. If the relationship depends on your compliance, your resistance reveals that dependence. If their sense of power depends on your emotional reaction, your calmness reveals how much they relied on provoking you. If they need you to constantly reassure them, your withdrawal from that role can expose an insecurity they previously managed through your attention. You do not need to expose or diagnose anyone. Simply observe what happens when you calmly protect yourself. Healthy people may disagree with your boundaries, but they can eventually recognize your right to have them. A destructive pattern often becomes louder when it loses access to the control it once had. Your boundary is not cruelty. It is information about where you end and another person begins, and recognizing that distinction can make the entire relationship much clearer. There is a particular kind of discomfort that can emerge when someone realizes they can no longer control how you respond to them. If they have become accustomed to getting your attention through anger, guilt, criticism, affection, withdrawal, or emotional pressure, your independence can feel deeply threatening to the dynamic they have relied upon. This does not mean every controlling person is consciously planning each reaction, nor does it mean that every conflict is evidence of narcissism. But when control has become central to a relationship, your refusal to surrender it can expose the structure underneath. Perhaps you once responded immediately whenever they became upset. You explained yourself for hours because you wanted to restore peace. You apologized even when you were uncertain what you had done wrong. You changed your plans because you feared their reaction. Over time, they may have learned that emotional pressure produced predictable results. They became accustomed to your anxiety, becoming their reassurance. Then something changes. You stop arguing. You stop over-explaining. You make decisions without seeking permission. You allow them to experience disappointment without rushing to fix it. Suddenly, the old methods do not work in the same way. This can produce an intense reaction because your independence communicates something powerful. You cannot determine my emotional state anymore. For someone who depends on control to feel secure, that realization can be unsettling. They may attempt to provoke you because anger is easier to manage than uncertainty. They may criticize you because making you defend yourself restores the old pattern. They may withdraw affection in the hope that you will chase them. They may create accusations because accusations can pull you back into explanation and emotional engagement. The important thing is not to become obsessed with interpreting every reaction. Watch the pattern instead. Does the person respect your autonomy? Can they tolerate your disagreement? Can they accept a boundary without punishing you for having one? Can you make independent choices without being made to feel guilty for them? A healthy relationship leaves room for two separate human beings to exist. You can love someone without surrendering your individuality. You can care about their feelings without becoming responsible for regulating them. When someone reacts harshly simply because you have reclaimed your freedom, the problem may not be that you became distant. It may be that the relationship had become dependent on you remaining controllable. When someone repeatedly criticizes, humiliates, confuses, or blames you, the deepest damage may not come from the individual insult itself. It can come from what happens gradually inside your mind. When negative messages are repeated often enough, you may begin questioning your own judgment, your memories, your intentions, and eventually your value. The person may not simply be trying to win an argument. Their behavior can create an environment in which you become increasingly uncertain about yourself. This is particularly powerful when the criticism is inconsistent. One day you are told that you are too emotional, and the next day you are accused of not caring enough. You may be criticized for speaking, then criticized for remaining silent. You may be told that you are selfish when you establish a boundary, yet expected to sacrifice your needs whenever the other person wants something. Because there is no stable standard, you can spend enormous energy trying to discover what version of yourself will finally be acceptable. Over time, you may start monitoring everything you say. Before expressing an opinion, you anticipate their reaction. Before making a decision, you imagine whether they will become angry. Before trusting your own feelings, you ask whether you are somehow overreacting. Your attention becomes focused less on your own experience and more on managing another person's emotional response. This is where the erosion of self can become especially painful. You may begin apologizing automatically. You may minimize your accomplishments. You may hesitate to trust people who treat you kindly because you have become accustomed to questioning yourself. Even when the conflict ends, the internal questioning can continue. The way back is not necessarily to prove that every accusation was false. It is to rebuild your relationship with your own perception. Ask yourself what actually happened. Write down important events when necessary. Notice patterns rather than isolated moments. Speak with trustworthy people who can offer grounded perspectives. Most importantly, allow yourself to have feelings without immediately putting them on trial. You do not have to accept another person's version of you simply because they repeat it with confidence. Their judgment is not an objective measurement of your character. When you begin trusting your own observations again, the fog created by constant criticism can gradually lift, and you can recognize that your identity does not belong to the person who tried to define it for you. If this is helping you understand what happened, without blaming yourself for someone else's behavior, stay with me. And if someone you love needs to hear this, share it with them. Because understanding the dynamic is not about hating the other person, it is about finally seeing yourself clearly. Shame can be one of the most painful emotions a person can experience because it does not simply say, "I made a mistake." It whispers something much deeper. There is something wrong with me. When someone carries intense unresolved shame, they may struggle to sit with that feeling without becoming overwhelmed. Instead of recognizing their insecurity directly, they may unconsciously move the feeling outward and place responsibility for it onto another person. This is where blame can become a psychological defense. Rather than admitting, "I feel rejected," they may say, "You are trying to abandon me." Rather than facing, "I feel inadequate," they may accuse someone else of being arrogant or selfish. Instead of acknowledging fear, they may create accusations that force the other person into a defensive position. The painful emotion remains outside themselves, where it feels easier to manage. For the person receiving the blame, this can become deeply confusing. You may find yourself constantly explaining your intentions, proving your loyalty, or apologizing for things you never intended to do. The conversation gradually stops being about what actually happened and becomes about convincing the other person that you are not the person they claim you are. This dynamic can be especially damaging when the accusations are repeated. Eventually, you may begin wondering whether there is some truth in them. You might ask yourself, maybe I really am selfish, maybe I really am difficult, maybe I really did cause all of this. The emotional burden shifts from the person experiencing the unresolved shame to the person being blamed for it. Understanding this mechanism does not mean declaring that every accusation is projection. Sometimes criticism contains legitimate information, and emotional maturity requires examining our own behavior honestly. The important distinction is whether both people can reflect, take responsibility, and repair harm, or whether accountability consistently moves in only one direction. You can examine yourself without accepting someone else's entire narrative about you. You can acknowledge mistakes without accepting humiliation. You can apologize for something specific without apologizing for your existence. When blame becomes a permanent substitute for self-reflection, the relationship loses the possibility of genuine healing. Real healing requires a person to eventually turn inward and ask, what am I feeling? What does it belong to? And what responsibility is actually mine? Without that willingness, another person's shoulders can become the place where unresolved shame is repeatedly deposited. There is something deeply revealing about what happens when you begin healing from an unhealthy relationship dynamic. The person who once had access to your attention, reactions, and emotional energy may suddenly discover that those things are no longer available in the same way. You become calmer, you stop explaining every decision, you no longer feel compelled to respond immediately to every accusation. You begin making choices based on what is healthy for you, rather than what will prevent someone else from becoming upset. That transformation can feel threatening to a person who depended on the old dynamic. Your healing changes the emotional balance because you are no longer responding from fear, guilt, or desperation. You may still care about them, but caring no longer means abandoning yourself. You can hear their disappointment without immediately trying to eliminate it. You can recognize their anger without believing that you must fix it. This is often where manipulation becomes easier to recognize. If someone previously gained influence by making you feel guilty, your increased self-awareness weakens that strategy. If they relied on your need for approval, your growing self-respect makes approval less powerful. If they depended on you chasing after them whenever they withdrew, your ability to tolerate distance changes the entire pattern. Your healing may therefore produce resistance, but that resistance does not mean you are doing something wrong. Sometimes people become uncomfortable when the role you played in their life changes. The person who was always available becomes less available. The person who always apologized begins asking questions. The person who tolerated disrespect begins saying no. But healing is not revenge. You are not becoming healthier to punish someone. You are becoming healthier because you have finally recognized that your emotional life deserves protection. This distinction matters because it prevents you from making your recovery dependent on their reaction. If you become calm only because you want them to notice your calmness, you are still emotionally connected to their response. Genuine healing happens when your peace becomes valuable, even if they never acknowledge it. You do not need them to admit what they did before you are allowed to move forward. You do not need an apology before you can rebuild yourself. You do not need them to understand your boundaries before those boundaries become legitimate. Sometimes, the most powerful evidence of healing is not that the other person changes, but that you stop organizing your life around whether they will change, because your sense of safety and worth no longer depends on their behavior. When a person behaves with extreme control, arrogance, cruelty, or emotional domination, it can look like strength from the outside. They may speak with certainty, refuse accountability, demand attention, or become aggressive when challenged. But intensity should not automatically be confused with inner strength. Sometimes the strongest looking behavior is actually a defense against feelings of vulnerability that the person cannot comfortably tolerate. A person who feels secure within themselves generally does not need to constantly prove their superiority. They can tolerate disagreement without experiencing it as humiliation. They can admit mistakes without feeling that their entire identity has collapsed. They can allow another person to succeed without interpreting that success as a threat to their own worth. Genuine confidence leaves room for other people to exist. Emotional fragility can look very different. A small criticism may feel enormous. A boundary may be interpreted as rejection. Someone else's independence may awaken feelings of being unnecessary. When those feelings become overwhelming, the person may respond by becoming controlling, dismissive, or attacking. The external behavior becomes a protective shell around an internal experience that feels too painful to acknowledge. This does not mean we should diagnose someone simply because they become defensive or angry. Human beings can react poorly when they are stressed, frightened, or ashamed. What matters is the repeated pattern and the willingness to take responsibility afterward. If someone consistently responds to vulnerability by humiliating others, that behavior remains harmful regardless of what may exist underneath it. Understanding possible emotional roots should never become an excuse for tolerating abuse. For the person on the receiving end, this distinction can be freeing. You may have spent a long time believing that the other person's confidence proved that you were the weak one. Their certainty may have made you question yourself. Their aggression may have convinced you that they had greater emotional power. But loudness is not emotional strength, control is not security, intimidation is not confidence, and the ability to make another person afraid does not demonstrate genuine inner stability. Real strength allows complexity. It can say, "I was wrong." It can tolerate discomfort. It can hear another person's feelings without immediately attacking them. It can experience shame without turning that shame into punishment. Once you understand this, you may stop measuring your worth against someone else's performance of power. You no longer need to defeat their confidence or prove yourself stronger. You simply recognize that another person's emotional defenses do not define your value, and their apparent power does not determine the strength you carry within yourself. Understanding why someone behaves in a hurtful way can create a powerful temptation to excuse that behavior. You may begin thinking they must have been hurt before, or they are acting this way because they are afraid. And slowly you start accepting treatment that you would never tell someone else to tolerate. Compassion becomes dangerous when it requires you to abandon your own dignity. It is possible to recognize that a person carries emotional wounds without taking responsibility for healing those wounds. Their childhood experiences, insecurities, fears, disappointments, or unresolved shame may help explain certain behaviors, but an explanation is not the same thing as permission. Pain can influence behavior, but it does not give anyone the right to repeatedly intimidate, manipulate, humiliate, or control another person. This distinction is especially important in relationships where you have become the emotional caretaker. You may find yourself constantly asking what they need, why they are angry, how you can calm them down, or what you can change to prevent another conflict. Eventually, their emotional world becomes your full-time responsibility while your own needs disappear into the background. Healthy compassion has boundaries. You can say, "I understand that you are hurting, but I will not accept being insulted." You can recognize someone's fear while refusing to let that fear dictate your decisions. You can wish someone healing without remaining close enough to be repeatedly harmed by them. Protecting yourself does not make you heartless. In fact, boundaries can be one of the clearest expressions of emotional responsibility because they prevent resentment, exhaustion, and self-abandonment from becoming the foundation of the relationship. You also do not need to hate the person in order to leave their unhealthy behavior behind. Hatred can keep you psychologically connected just as strongly as longing can. Sometimes, freedom means reaching a place where you no longer need revenge, recognition, or an apology to validate your experience. Your task is not to diagnose them, rescue them, or force them to confront their wounds. Your task is to remain honest about what their behavior does to you. If contact repeatedly leaves you frightened, confused, diminished, or emotionally exhausted, that experience deserves attention. Compassion says, "I can see that you are hurting." A boundary says, "I will not allow your pain to become permission to hurt me." Both can exist together, and learning to hold them together allows you to care about another person's humanity without sacrificing your own. Maybe the deepest truth is not that the narcissist wanted to hurt you because you were weak, difficult, or unworthy. Maybe what happened was far more revealing. Your presence touched something they did not know how to face within themselves, and when you stopped carrying the emotional burden for them, the conflict became visible. But you do not need to spend your life studying their wounds. At some point, healing asks you to turn your attention back toward yourself, not toward revenge, not toward proving that you were right. not toward waiting for them to finally understand what they did, toward you. You can understand someone's pain without accepting their cruelty. You can have compassion without surrendering your boundaries. You can forgive without reopening a door that continually harms you. And perhaps the most important thing you can remember is this: their anger does not define your character, their accusations do not define your identity, and their inability to love you in a healthy way does not determine whether you are worthy of love. You do not have to become harder because someone hurt you. You have to become clearer, clear about what you feel, clear about what you will tolerate, clear about where your responsibility ends and another person's responsibility begins. Because healing is not the moment they finally regret losing you. Healing is the moment you no longer need their regret to feel whole. You stop asking why they wanted to destroy your confidence, and you begin rebuilding the part of yourself that never deserved to be destroyed. And when you finally return to yourself, their behavior may still have a history, their wounds may still exist, and their choices may still belong to them, but they no longer have the authority to tell you who you are,